I want to take a look at using a calculator to um, evaluate trig functions. So I have here a TI-83 Plus emulator on my computer, so I'll be using that, just typing stuff in here. First thing I want to point out is that when you're talking with your calculator about trig, or any angles for that matter, make sure you're talking the same language. So click on the mode button, and the thing to notice here is the third line is radians or degrees. We want to make sure for the time being here that we are talking degrees. So I'm using the arrow keys and moving myself down to degrees. Once I have that, I'm going to hit enter. Okay, so now anytime you type an angle in, it knows that you're talking in degrees. Next week we'll talk about radians and we'll use that mode at that point. But for now we're doing degrees. Okay. So then I'm going to quit, which is the second function of mode. So now if I want to find, for instance, the sine of an angle, I'd say sine of 27 degrees. So I'll type in sine 27, close the parentheses, and hit enter. So it has figured out a triangle that has a 27-degree angle in it. It's looked at the opposite side and the hypotenuse and divided, gave me that number there, 0.4539, etc. Okay. And what's the cosine of 27 degrees? Well, cosine 27. Now the mode, by putting it in degrees, right, when I type cosine of 27, the input to the trig function is an angle. And so the calculator is saying, hey, I'm doing an angle. Is this 27 degrees? Is this 27 radians? We told it degrees, so this is handling it as 27 degrees. And we press enter. And there's the cosine of 27 degrees. So both the sine and the cosine of 27 degrees. Okay. Likewise, you can use tangent, so on. Well, I say so on. Really, the calculator has only three trig functions, sine, cosine, and tangent. So what do I do if I want, say, the cosecant? Well, the cosecant is the reciprocal of the sine. And I point out that it looks like there's a sine to the -1, which might look like it's the reciprocal of sine. But unfortunately, it's not. This is one thing we have to be very careful of. If I want, I'll talk about what this means in a minute. But if I want the cosecant, then I have to think of it as it's the reciprocal of sine. I need 1 divided by the sine of the angle. So 1 divided by the sine of 27 is going to be the cosecant of 27. That's the only way I have of evaluating the cosecant. Okay, so it takes the reciprocal of the sine. Now, what does this thing here? What does the sine of the -1 do? Well, the -1 exponent is used in two different ways in math. One of them is to signify take the reciprocal, like we did here. The other is to do an inverse function. So if a function does one thing, the inverse function undoes it. So for instance, let's try an angle that's a little got a nicer answer to it. So I'm going to look at the sine of 30 degrees. And the sine of 30 degrees, if you think about your 30, 60, 90 triangle, is equal to a half. So when I hit enter here, it should say 0.5. And what the inverse sine does, so if I take on this, so sine inverse, that's sine to the -1 power. Again, that -1 is not reciprocal in this case. It means inverse function. So if I input the 0.5, right, the trig function took an angle of 30 degrees and gave me back a ratio of sides opposite to hypotenuse is 0.5. The arcsine goes the other way. So it takes that inverse of that input of 0.5 and says, what angle did this come from? What angle has a sine equal to 0.5? And it says, well, the angle is 30 degrees. So the sine function went from an angle to a ratio of sides. The inverse sine, or sometimes it's called the arcsine, goes backwards. It takes the ratio of sides, says, hey, this is opposite over hypotenuse. Tell me what angle it came from. Okay, we will look at inverse trig functions much more substantially later in the quarter. But for now, we're going to use them just to quickly calculate some angles in some of the application problems. Okay, but be very careful. Sine inverse is not cosecant, right? That -1 exponent does not mean reciprocal. So there's there's some quick trig on your calculator. Have fun.